thank you for those who have thought about how we might live the Christian moral life. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, today we are taking a look at chapter 16 out of this book, Making the Whole Person Whole, Papers and Presentations on Religion, Ethics, and Medicine. This is a chapter in which Dr. Provonsha deals with the whole question of situation ethics, which was quite controversial at his time. Less so, and I must say, he begins the chapter sort of bristling, a little bit defensive about those who have been critical of situation ethics, I think for two reasons. One is that he knew some of the people who were writing in this field, and he thought that they were being treated unfairly by lots of Christians, particularly lots of conservative Christians. So he sort of bristled for that reason. But he also felt that there was need for a more flexible approach to the moral life than is sometimes the case in our community. So it was not merely that he bristled because of what he knew about these people personally, but he also was a little concerned about how, quote, legalistic some Christians can be, and particularly some Adventists can be. So some of you may have seen the handout I sent out on the internet, and I'd like to begin with this case, which is one of the cases in Dr. Fletcher's book, Situation Ethics, the New Morality, Joseph Fletcher's book. By the way, he's really the father of Protestant bioethics. He wrote a book called Morals and Medicine in the early 1950s, which was the emergence of Protestant thought in bioethics. Roman Catholics had been thinking about bioethics for centuries, but it was that book, Morals and Medicine. So for most people, he's remembered as a bioethicist. And he also made this contribution in the area of situation ethics. So the book, I think, had a lot of discussion because there were many, many cases that he thought we should consider, and they are quite provocative. I'm hoping that we will decide what we should do with Mrs. Bergmeyer when she comes back from the Ukraine to our church. All right? Should we celebrate her arrival? Should we have her receive a pastoral visit? Should we prevent her from having church office? Or should we censure her? We have the formal possibility of censuring her. Or should we disfellowship her altogether? So here's the case, and I'll go through some other things before we come back to the case. And I want you to keep this case in mind so that you can decide which of those options we should take. Okay, here are the words of Joseph Fletcher in his book, Situation Ethics, the New Morality, which came out in the late 1960s. As the Russian armies drove westward to meet the Americans and the British at Elbe, is that how you say it? Or Elbe?
No, Elbe.
Elbe. A Soviet patrol picked up a Mrs. Bergmeyer, foraging for food for her 3 children. Unable even to get word to the children, and without any clear reason for it, she was taken off to a prison camp in the Ukraine. Her husband had been captured in the Bulge and was taken to a prison of war camp in Wales. So she's in Ukraine and he is in Wales. But when he was returned to Berlin, he spent weeks and weeks rounding up his 2 children, one age 12 and the other age 10, a girl and a boy. The 2 were found in a detention school run by the Russians. The oldest, the 3rd child, 15 years old, was found hiding in the cellar near Alexanderplatz. Their mother's whereabouts remained a mystery to them, but they never stopped searching. She was more than anything else that was needed to reknit them as a family in that dire situation of hunger, chaos, and fear. So now The father had been in Wales. He comes back to Berlin. He finds the children, and they're trying to reconvene their home there in Berlin, but they don't know where his wife and their mother is. So she's in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine, Mrs. Bergmeyer learns through a sympathetic commandant that her husband and family were trying to keep together and find her. But the rules of the camp allowed them to release her for only 2 reasons. 1, illness and needing medical facilities beyond what the camp could provide. And 2, pregnancy, in which case she would be returned to Germany as a liability. So she turned things over in her mind and finally asked a friendly Volga German camp guard to impregnate her, which he did. Her condition being medically verified, she was sent back to Berlin and to her family. They welcomed her with open arms, even when she told them how she managed it. When the child was born, they loved him more than all the rest. So she gets back to Berlin, right? And then the child is born there, presumably. When the child was born, they loved him more than all the rest, on the view that little Dietrich had done more for the family than anybody else. Now, okay, my question is, she belongs to the Berlin, or one of the Berlin Seventh-day Adventist churches, and she has showed up now with her little Dietrich, and she's reunited with her family and with her other 3 children, and you are going to decide what you're going to do about this. Maybe nothing. Maybe you'll have a big celebration, welcoming her back, and maybe a birthday party for Dietrich. Or maybe you'll send her a pastoral visit, or maybe you will restrict her from church office, or maybe you will censure her, or maybe you will disfellowship her. All right? So keep that in mind as we go through this case, and I'd like to know what you would do. Now, I'd like to just begin with a couple of definitions and then move forward. I'd like to just leave some impressions. There's a lot of detail in this handout, but I'd just like to leave some impressions and not spend too much time on the detail. Situation ethics means making cases, making decisions on a case-by-case basis on the assumption that there are no absolute rules. There are no exceptionless rules. All rules have exceptions, except the rule that all rules have exceptions. And so, no matter what situation we are in, we ought to make our decision with respect to the needs of that particular situation and using the resources that we have in that situation, the conceptual resources that we have. We ought not to rely too much on the past or our anticipations of the future. We can consider that, but what's really required is that we pay attention to what's happening here and now, in this context, in this situation, in this setting, and do what's right here. Now, Fletcher says that may allow us to lie, to commit adultery, to cheat, do all sorts of things that we may not otherwise do because they might be required by the circumstances we're in. So that's the basic idea. And sometimes this is confused with relativism, which is really trying to answer a different question. Situation is trying to answer the question, are there any exception-less rules? And its answer is no. Relativism has to do with 2 questions. From where do these moral norms emerge? And secondly, by which standards can they be evaluated? And relativism says that moral norms of whatever kind emerge from particular societies, and they can be judged only by those within their society. So there are no transcultural, no norms that are applicable to all societies everywhere. Every society has its own norms, and what happens in that society can be judged only by the norms within that society. All right? So, that's asking a different question than situationism, because one could have different moral norms emerging from a particular society, and those norms may be unconditional or conditional. They may have exceptions or not have exceptions. So relativism, though it's sometimes used interchangeably with situationism, is not to be confused with the two. Okay, with those definitions down, I'd like to leave one early impression, and that is this. Strictly speaking, situationism is not the new morality. It's the old morality. It has been here from the very beginning of human thought. It has to do with what we ought to have in mind. I didn't bring a handout, Jeff.
Sorry.
There's one on the internet. Situation has to do with exceptions. It has to do with difficult cases. It has to do with what to do when our moral expectations conflict somehow. And every society from the very beginning has had some way of dealing with that issue. They have had elders sitting at the gate. They have had oracles they can consult. They have had priests. They have had maybe witch doctors, whatever. They all had some way of dealing with difficult cases. After all, there have been difficult ethical cases from the very beginning. And mostly these difficult cases come when one expectation clashes with another expectation, and we're not quite able to figure out what to do. And so we have these people to whom we can turn: judges, elders, priests, rabbis, so forth. Now, it's interesting, I think, that all of these ask the one who's in a particular perplexing situation to consult with somebody else. We may differ as to whom these people consult with, but the idea that the ancients had, which is, I think, a pretty sound idea, that is, if one is thinking of doing something ethically unusual, one should get some counsel from those who are wiser than one is. So you have this way of dealing with things. John Dibdall once talked about this, of a place where he had served as a missionary, and where there was a perplexity in the community. The people all sat around all night long, and they would not leave until there was some consensus as to what should be done. So from the various early days, people have recognized that there are exceptions, there are conflicts, and they have set up procedures and personnel with which to deal with this. But let's go further. In Aristotle, you have the notion of phronesis or phronesis, and that has to do with a wise person who discerns what ought to be done in the case with all the circumstances of that case in view, plus all of that person's history and background. And so that person is very discerning, and that person is able to determine what ought to be done in a particular case, given his training, given his background, and so forth. Aristotle says, quite frankly, one cannot be an ethical person as a child. One has to have enough experience to have moral discernment, and that is a very important principle that we have in mind. But if one goes into the Middle Ages, we have a similar situation with two of the top three thinkers in the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages. You have Thomas Aquinas, number one, who emphasizes how God has laws that are expressive of God's nature, and these laws, universal law, and then the natural law, and then the civic law, and then the biblical law, all of these are very neatly organized and interwoven, and there is a sense in which these are expressive of the very character of God. And even, one has to be careful here, but even God, in some sense, has to conform to these because they reflect the very nature of things. But you have two other thinkers of that time, William of Ockham in England, and then you have Duns Scotus in Scotland, who really emphasize the will of God, such that anything that God says ought to be done is to be done by virtue of God saying it. So that sets up an opportunity for a kind of situation ethics, because God might command this in one occasion, and this on another occasion, and this on another occasion. And so there can be quite a bit of variation, but the constant throughout is that God's will and God's unfettered will, God's sovereign will, God's majestic will, God's unquestionable will settles what ought to be done on a case-by-case basis. So that really opens up the situation for some kind of opens up the possibility of a situation ethics. Okay, but then in the Reformation era, you have a big debate between those who are more or less Lutheran and those who are more or less Reformed, more or less Calvinist. The Lutherans said there are two purposes for law. One of them is to convict us of sin. The other is to restrain evil in the community. And that's it. After that, Martin Luther wanted us to be led far more intuitively by the Spirit of God. Martin Luther was very cautious about building into the moral life any kind of prevailing norms. The Reformed people, following John Calvin, added something that made a very different outcome culturally for hundreds of years, and that is the Calvinist people believe, yes, law is there to help us understand our sin. Law is also there to help us restrain society. But thirdly, in addition to those two, thirdly, the law functions as a guide for the continuing Christian life. And that's precisely what Luther did not want to have. He did not want to have this idea of the law helping us as we go through life. Now, you have other examples. You have the Quakers talking about the inner light and how one ought to be sensitive to the light of God. How do they put it? That which is of God in each person. And that which is of God in each person has priority, ethically speaking, over everything else. So there's another kind of loosening up of the idea that there are strict, absolute, unconditional, exceptionless norms. I haven't put it down here, but I think Enlightenment thinking in a very different way does this, because the Enlightenment asks people to rely upon their own reason about what is right and wrong, rather than to defer to some kind of authority. Now, the Enlightenment people, particularly Immanuel Kant, did not believe in situation ethics altogether. There could be no one more opposed to situation ethics than Immanuel Kant. There is a categorical imperative for which there is no exception whatsoever, no matter what. But still, pulling back from the notion of divine authority as the source of our moral wisdom and turning to human reason as the source of our moral wisdom is another way of doing that. And then in our time, we have charismatic Christians, right, who talk about being led by the Holy Spirit. Their lives are shaped by the Holy Spirit. And charismatic Christians are less inclined to say, what does the law require? Now I'm talking about the moral law. What does the moral law require? Than they are to say, well, where is the Holy Spirit leading me? So it's another way of sort of loosening up this idea of the Christian life as being a legalistic life. Here I'm using the word legalistic not in the sense of particular exceptionless rules, but also more general, thinking of the moral life in a more general way. Now, when it comes to the 20th century, the first impression I wanted to leave is that situation ethics, strictly speaking, is not entirely new. From the very beginning of time, there has been the realization that there needs to be some flexibility because we face new problems, because our expectations sometimes clash, and so forth. But in the 20th century, the impression I'd like to leave is that there were two waves of situation ethics, the first in Germany and the second in Anglo-America. And the first in Germany was around World War II times. And it's interesting, you get a whole series of books like this. You have Emil Brunner writing a book called The Divine Imperative. You have Rudolf Bultmann writing about radical obedience. You have Karl Barth talking about the command of God. You have Dietrich Bonhoeffer talking about, he has some mandates there, but still there can be exceptions to that. And famously, he violated what would typically be an ethical expectation of Christians and participated in a plot to kill Hitler. So, what sees there in that period of time is two things. A heavy emphasis upon situational determinations of what is right and wrong. Secondly, a heavy emphasis upon the command of God. And it is sometimes almost chilling when one reads, say, Karl Barth on this. Karl Barth says, one ought to do what God commands one to do in this moment with no regard to anything else. And the command of God is to be measured by nothing other than the command of God. And how does one know what the command of God requires? Barth says, when you've heard the command of God, you've heard it. And you have no doubt that you've heard it. But once you've heard it, you have no right to do anything but to choose to obey it or not. Now, that's in Church Dogmatics, Volume 2, Part 2. We tend to think of a volume as one book, but for Barth, a volume might be 4 books, each book being 800 pages long. So this is Volume 2, Part 2, where he talks about the command of God. When we get down to Volume 3, Part 4, that is Volume 3, Book 4, he really softens that. And he starts talking about how we can discern the will of God in the patterns of God's steadfast covenant love. So it's and then finally at the very end, he writes a book called The Humanity of God. What a contrast. But what was going on? These writers were all living in the time of German authoritarianism in general and Nazism in particular. So the German culture is very authoritarian, and Nazism was even more so. And in effect, this is what they were saying. You can choose between obeying the command of Hitler, people like that, or you can believe and obey the command of God. And in that very extreme circumstance, they all came down on the side of obeying the command of God. And unless we put those words in that context, what they have to say about the command of God is really, I think, quite offensive. It is very, very authoritarian and I think off-putting. Now, I probably have told you this story before, but there's a very poignant story about Karl Barth and Emil Brunner. They were good friends and so forth, but Brunner made a technical move toward natural theology a little bit, and Karl Barth just, boom! He wrote another book called Nine. That was the title of it. Nine! And he just slashed and cut, and he attacked Brunner's thought and very close to Brunner's person without mercy. And most people wish he hadn't done that. Wish he had just let it go. But Emil Brunner said something that always makes me wince. He said, Karl Barth is like a friend of mine who hears somebody rustling in the bush. He's a sentry, he hears something rustling in the bush, and he shoots them dead. I'm the one rustling in the bush, and Barth shot me dead, not realizing I was his friend. A very, very tough time. Now there is a legend, and it has some basis in truth, but I need to look it up to be sure. And that is, as Brunner was dying, Barth sent a messenger and said, yes. Yes. But, it's very, very, these are very urgent times. I don't think we can realize sitting here where we are, how difficult those times were. And so these theologians just boom, boom, boom. You obey the command of God, or you obey Hitler, and what it means to obey the command of God may require you to do some unusual things, even trying to kill Hitler. Okay, but then you get another wave of situation ethics toward the last part of the 1960s, and you get books like John A.T. Robinson's book, Honest to God, Joseph Fletcher's book, the new situation ethics, the new morality. You get Paul Lehman's book, Ethics in a Christian Context. You get Paul Tillich's book, Morality and Beyond. Beyond, you get H. Richard Niebuhr's book, The Responsible Self. All of these, in different ways, are suggesting that the moral life is not to be thought of in terms of obeying inflexible rules. The one who was most famous about all of this is Joseph Fletcher. I've summarized here. His 6 propositions are, he has 4 written working principles in addition to these 6 propositions. But to be candid with you, they are so conceptually confused that I didn't bring them. For instance, he uses the word positivism in a way that nobody else in the whole history of thought ever used the word positivism. So I haven't brought that. Also, he uses the word relativism in a way that's not standard. So, but here one can get Fletcher's 6 proposition. He says, love is the only absolute. It is the only intrinsic good. Christian decision-making is based on love. Justice is love distributed. Love wants the good for anyone, whoever they are. Only the end justifies the means. Love is acted out situationally, not prescriptively. When people looked at this, they said, basically, this is utilitarianism. What Fletcher means by love is utilitarianism, and it's a particular kind of utilitarianism which is called act utilitarianism, which says we ought to decide on a case-by-case basis, deed-by-deed basis, setting-by-setting basis, what we ought to do. The most famous act utilitarian today, and he's very clearly utilitarian and very clearly an act utilitarian, is Peter Singer. And there are famous interviews of him, one in which he was asked, if you could save all the citizens of New York City from a terrible attack from an enemy by torturing one innocent child, would you do it? And his answer is most emphatically yes. At least Singer's clear. But you know, there are other people who would say, if the only way we can save our society is to kill innocent children, we might as well go up in smoke.
What about the rest of the United States?
Pardon me?
Would the rest of the United States be okay?
Well, let's just what if it covered the whole United States, right? Let's cover the whole United States. Yeah, done.
Well, I was thinking that it would be okay if you're prepared to pay the price for what you've done. That is, maybe you save the world, but you've killed a human being, and whatever the law requires of you, then you pay that price.
Now that's different from what Singer is saying and other act utilitarians. And I think you're right. That is, if you did that, that would almost, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
That would almost be an act of civil disobedience, right? One, in civil disobedience, one publicly violates the law in order to do 2 things. Show the injustice of the law and also to show one's respect for the law. And therefore, one publicly objects and then one publicly takes the punishment. Right. Well done.
In the Rwanda and South African problems, the peace and reconciliation committees, you know, they stopped the war and genocide by really bending the law. They didn't punish the people who had been committing, I mean, maybe some of them, but I think Donna's question is very important because even after peace and reconciliation, a lot of people are living with the murderers in Rwanda. I was just reading something about that. They are living in peace, but they're still struggling with what are we going to do with these people who did commit all these atrocities. So they did stop that, but I don't know if we can live with the consequences of doing that. But I also had a comment about the baby Dietrich. I mean, that's a thing that the Bible.
Comment about what?
Baby, your first
Oh,
baby.
baby Dietrich?
Baby
Oh, you're
Dietrich.
getting ahead. I want to get back to that. I'm watching the time. Okay, let me get you to that. Let me just say quickly that theologians responded to Fletcher over the years, and I think Philip Wogelman's idea of ethical presumptions, so that we don't come into the situation morally untutored, but we come quite conditioned by our Christian lives to act in a certain way. Sure, there are exceptions, but they have to be established because the presumption is in a different particular direction. We have a presumption in favor of speaking the truth. Do we all have to speak the truth? No, always, no. This is what I said in my own home, okay, so don't quote me. But one of my youngsters, when he was about this age, said, "Dad, is it always wrong to tell a lie?" I don't know how you'd answer that. And I said, you know, it's not always wrong to tell a lie, but you better be damn sure you know what you're doing if you're about to tell a lie. Because I said, really big. As far as I know, he's never told me a lie. There have been times I've asked him a question, he'd say, "Dad, I don't want to answer that question." And I said, okay, I'd rather you tell me that than tell me a lie. So, but then you also have John Bennett talking about middle axioms. John Bennett is one of the major professors for Dr. Winslow here. And John Bennett thought that between particular judgments and large principles like love, there ought to be middle axioms that mediate between the two. So you have that sort of thing going on. Jack Provonsha's own idea was, I think he said, yes, situation ethics is right, but it defines the situation too narrowly. The situation includes the whole of humanity, indeed, the whole great controversy. That's the situation. So, yes, we need to do what's right on a case-by-case basis, but the situation we need to keep in mind is quite cosmic. I think the most powerful of theological objection to this, which has had lasting impact, is the work of Stanley Hauerwas, who said, listen, for hundreds of years, ethics was not taught as though the main issue is decision-making. Ethics was taught as though cultivating particular virtues is what's important. So for the ancients, the virtues of wisdom and courage and self-control and justice, these are the things one should be cultivating, not worrying too much about decision-making, but cultivating these virtues. And then for the Christians, they add faith, hope, and love. So if we spend our lives thinking about these virtues and cultivating them in our lives and in other lives, we can be less concerned about decision-making, and he felt like decision-making has been overemphasized. And I think he's had a powerful influence on contemporary ethics. There's a little tension between those who talk about principles and decision-making and those who talk about virtues, and I think we ought to talk about both of them. It's hard to know what virtues are, in fact, virtuous without some principles, and also it's hard to implement these virtues without to do well by these principles without some virtues. So you need them back and forth. But there is some tension in the group about that. Now, I mentioned here some philosophers who have done similar things. Kurt Beyer will talk about the moral point of view. He asks us to sort of calm down and think about this in a more rational way. Roderick Firth has the idea of an ideal observer. That is, we ought to imagine as though there's a being who's all-knowing and all-loving and so forth. It's as though we are to think what God might think of this, even though there is no God, right? Imagine what God would think if there were a God, that sort of thing. I think also the idea of John Rawls, that we ought to sit around in a decision-making context. He worked this out with the issue of justice, but it has wider applicability, I think. We ought to sit around and make decisions as though we know everything about the universe, but nothing about ourselves in particular. We don't know our age, gender, orientation, sexual, nationality, ethnicity. If we didn't know anything about ourselves in particular, but everything else in general, what would we decide? If I didn't know if I'm sitting here or standing here this morning, or if I just fallen off a railroad, onto the railroad track by train, going right down there, not far from us, and here's this man almost to Los Angeles. Started off in Guatemala, almost to Los Angeles. He falls off the train, and they take him up to the emergency room. How would I want to be treated if I were that person instead of the fortunate person I am? And Rawls says, well, he's on purely secular grounds. He said we can come to the conclusions about what's right or wrong if we try to think about these matters behind what he calls the veil of ignorance, which blinds us to all these particularities. The one that makes the most sense to me is the idea of levels of moral discourse. And for me, that sort of solves the problem. That is, we have at one level particular judgments about what ought to be done in this specific case. But somewhat more generally, we have policies and protocols and established procedures there. But somewhat more generally, see, we're going like this, like this, like this. Somewhat more generally, we will have principles and virtues and theories of vision, values, like that. And then further up above that, we'll have big theories like utilitarianism and Kantianism and natural law. Still further, and then still further up there, we're going to have huge worldviews, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist. So the further up we go, the fewer exceptions there will be. For instance, I think it's a good rule not to serve or drink alcoholic beverages. But on 2 occasions in my life, when people were in extreme pain and there was no other way to relieve their pain, I have indeed served alcoholic beverages. Now, I think that's in harmony with the idea of relieving pain and fostering well-being. And when sometimes I've been in really remote places, and that's all we had. And so on one occasion I served enough whiskey to say, okay, let's keep the whiskey going until that stops hurting. The other time I did with vodka, right? And one time I did the vodka over the phone, and I said, okay, let's figure out how much you can drink before you, to make the pain go away. And then you pour that much out in a glass, and then throw the rest of the vodka down the sink, so you don't drink too much.
What a waste of vodka.
Right? But it worked, right? Took enough vodka to relieve that pain. But I think, well, that's a particular judgment, but somewhere up here, I think there's a principle that says relieve pain wherever you can is what I had to follow. Now, here is a rule, very general, for which I can imagine no exception. Always do what you think is the right thing. Can you think of any exception to that? No. But that comes down to many, many more particular judgments that could vary. And it seems to me that Fletcher talks about these particular judgments, about this woman, Mrs. Bergmeyer, and so forth. Another woman on a train who asked him if it would be okay for her to seduce a person from a hostile nation, and so forth and so on. Well, okay, one might have differences about these particular judgments, but the further up one goes, the fewer those exceptions will be. Okay, back to Mrs. Bergmeyer. what should we do with her? Ladan, we can say nothing. We can celebrate her arrival. We can give her a pastoral visit. We can remove her from church offices.
You're asking me?
Yeah, and we could censure her, or we could disfellowship her.
Judith did the same thing.
Excuse me?
Judith.
Judas.
Judith. The daughter-in-law of Judah.
Judith. I'm
Judith.
sorry. Yeah.
She did the same thing. And God had nothing, no problem with that. The baby was the progenitor of our Jesus, wasn't it?
Okay, here we go. There's a group right back there, okay? Here's a group right back here. And then there's a group back there and another group here. 4 groups, and you are the members of a church in Berlin that has to decide what you will do with Mrs. Bergmeyer, okay? You've got 6 minutes to decide. So go for it. Turn around, make your groups, and...
Would you, for quickly, for latecomers, could you tell us just
Yes.
in 5 words or less?
Okay, no, it takes a little more than 5 words. The story is, Joseph Fletcher puts this out as a genuine story.
Okay.
It's during World War II times. The Russian army advances, and the American army is coming this way. The husband of the family is taken to Wales, and the woman is taken to the Ukraine. So the husband gets sent back to Berlin. He finds his children, his 3 children, and then he and the children are together. They don't know where their mother is. The mother is in Ukraine in a concentration camp. She learns that if she's pregnant, she will be released from the camp. And so she has a guard impregnate her, and she returns home to the church in Berlin, and the little boy is named Dietrich, and Joseph Fletcher says, everybody is delighted to have him. Now the question is, are you going to disfellowship her or whatever for doing what she did? Okay, real quickly, some groups go around, make a decision. There's a group right there. Turn around to Brother Chinnick.
Sure, have 2 wives, like sure. Now, if she enjoyed her encounter with the guy, that's different.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Right, you're in our group.
Jeff said they weren't married.
They said that 86 outside married.
Above I don't think I have
This subject has been simmering in the depths of my consciousness for years and years, because David has given us a nice overview. One of the first
completely tears up the family dynamic. There are going to be other consequences other than just showing up.
Well, he lectured on the question of situation ethics, and that apparently was a very lively issue in that era when Joseph Fletcher wrote his book on Seafaring. So, my very first era here at Loma Linda, I heard about a subject I never even thought of before in my life.
That's right. Because he's the one who committed adultery.
Come in wearing jeans.
Yes.
Even inside the commandments, there is
on the spot here, right? I think a couple of us first struggled with, why is this even an ethical issue? She was a very practical person who made a practical, pragmatic decision towards a very noble end. It upheld the supremacy and primacy of the family. It was redemptive in nature. Everyone was happy with the outcome. So what is it that actually makes this an ethical issue? It wasn't an ethical issue until you put it into a moral framework, historic framework. Then it becomes a moral issue, or is that an ethical issue? Not too sure. Who is the judge in this situation? So we had a little interesting discussion about this, and the dad might want to add is, the problem is the men. It's the men that were uncomfortable with this. Because men are sitting in judgment of what women do with their body.
Okay,
So-
get the mic over here.
Yeah,
He's not getting in trouble in your church.
Yes, but it, at the end of the time it was enshrouded with positive intent, love. It wasn't a selfish love, it was a noble love for reconstituting the family, and from that point of view, we neither see it as really an ethical or moral issue.
Okay. Right here, this is good.
Was that good?
he's the spokesperson here. Yeah, you?
Well, I just give one person's opinion. I don't think it was an ideal act, but I believe that where sin abounds, grace doth much more abound. Amen.
Our group of two
Yes.
talked backwards and forwards a bit here, and we didn't reach a consensus. However, I did, this last week, read the chapter in Provonsha's book, the book which you edited, and came away with the strong impression that Provonsha, in such circumstances, would be guided by the overarching principle. Ultimately, what matters is you should act from a motivation of agape. He, of course, he quoted the 4 principles of love that Tillich wrote about. And so in Ms. Bergemeyer's situation, love, the principle of love surely requires the community in the church to be lenient and not judge her. That's what I suspect Jack would have.
Right. Okay, over here too. Thank you very much, Buttersea. Now, I agree with you. Jack's use of the word love differs from Fletcher in this way, but you're right. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just adding to it. For Fletcher, love is a norm that's applied directly to the case. For Dr. Provonsha, the point is to do that which will make it possible for one to be a loving person. That's the issue here. So what he wants us to do is to restore the image of God such that that person can be a loving person. So it's a slightly different variation of that. I would say that Dr. Provonsha is more natural law theory than utilitarianism, because he thinks what's distinctive about human nature is what we should be supporting and promoting and so forth. He thinks that the capacity to love freely, volitionally, is what's important, whereas people like Aristotle would say maybe rationality, or Aquinas, maybe the beatific vision or something like that. But yeah, but the word love is very important, both faces. Yeah.
In our group, the overarching principle was love of the family, and we said leave it alone, love her, love the family. Little discussion whether a baby shower or don't celebrate, but the overarching thing was love her.
Why not? Why not celebrate?
It was divided. I'm on the side of baby shower. They probably need clothes.
I had a phone call a couple years ago from a woman who works at the General Conference, and she called my wife, and my wife said, you better take this call. So it's a friend of ours. I said, how's it going? She said, I am absolutely livid and embarrassed. I said, wow, what happened? My son has a child out of wedlock. And I said, really? Is that the problem? She said, yes. I said, you know, when you hold that little boy or little girl in your arms, it's not going to make one difference whether his parents were married. And I want you not to be ashamed. I want you to be proud. I want you to be happy. And I want you to put on Facebook that you're going to be a grandmother. I will never be a grandfather. Never. I know that. Do you realize how lucky you are to be a grandmother? And she said, really? Yes, I said, this is not bad news, this is good news. And sure enough, she just turned around, and she's happy with her son, grandson now, on Facebook, pictures of him going to Sabbath school. He is a blessing to that family. My dad used to say, there are no unwanted babies, there are only unscheduled ones. So, I think, so, you know, she just, what am I going to do when I go to the office and my, you know, the people at the General Conference know that? You're going to say, you are lucky to have a grandchild, and he is beautiful. That's what you're going to say. Okay, Jeff.
Go ahead.
Did he wind up marrying the girl?
No. It was a very tragic case because while she was pregnant, she left him for another man. So he has to share custody with his previous partner and her new partner. So that is very, very difficult. But when he's at their home, they have a great time.
I'm going to put a little sand in the ointment, perhaps, but it would pretty much tell you how I would feel if I were a board member. I think the Bergmeyer story is so classic in terms of what is going on today in our society that the focus is on the woman and not the man who impregnated her. What on earth led him to believe that he had a responsibility to do that? That's basically what I have to say. I think there's entirely too much going on in our society today where man somehow feels a responsibility to tell a woman how she should behave without looking at the male in our society.
Particularly as he has acted in such a way to give her very few positive options. Good point.
Can I have? This is not directly related to baby Dietrich, but I have a lingering question reading the Genesis, where not Genesis, but Exodus. When God sent Moses to Pharaoh to send my people away, he was not telling Pharaoh that, oh, we're going to go forever, we're going to leave the country. But he told Pharaoh through Moses that, well, we're going to go 3 days of journey and we'll worship the Lord there. So in a way, God was not really telling the whole story, but telling the only parts of the story. So I think that may be giving us some idea regarding this whole situation on ethics or theology. God is not just kind of boxed in 10 commandments, and this is the way, but I think he's showing some example to us to kind of give some something for the right, truth, or love, whatever the situation may be. That's probably the way to look at it.
How interesting. Let's keep moving so we can get a couple more here before time is out. You know, that was something Dr. Provonsha would say. He would say, we really need to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, but we don't have to tell the whole truth. And I think that's correct. Yes, back here.
Yeah, we had an advantage. We had Jerry.
Dr. Winslow has an advantage because he studied with John Bennett and knows all about middle axioms.
I think we were saved by the bell, David. It's about time to wrap it up. But since we constitute a Southern California Adventist church in the 21st century, of course we were going to accept Mrs. Bergmeyer back. What do you think we would do? And we'll love the baby. We did raise a few points. I think these were mostly mine.
That's why he has the microphone.
The kind of thinking that Fletcher calls on us to do, as with all consequentialists, where you're basing your decision on what you hope will be accomplished, requires an ability to predict outcomes about what would be good, both in the short and in the long term. I mean, good for whom, when. So, you know, that's just to be kept in mind. You could write a lot of different endings to the story. And most of us are not that good at predicting whether it's really going to work out well or not. So just one thought. Another one is that I think we're all contextualists, though, because if we just started changing the story a little bit, we get a different outcome. Yeah. Mrs. Bergmeyer noticed this really handsome Volga guard with whom she fell in love, and they had an affair. This was little Dietrich. That's another account. And if she were really a situation ethicist of Fletcher's type, she should have come home and said she was raped, because then she would have a different story, and then we wouldn't have the church might have had a different outcome. So, you know, we can go on with this, but those were just a few random thoughts.
Okay, is there another group here? Right here. You know, though, Jerry, I wondered if she could have described that event as rape, in the sense that she was, that thought had come to my mind, maybe not in a duplicitous way, but maybe in a genuine way. She could say she was raped because she had no other way to be reunited with her family. True. Okay, is there, did we get you over here? Okay, run.
Nobody has a
Okay, Peter.
What is in your belief, is there any tension inside the Ten Commandments?
Is there what?
Any tension?
Sure, there could be. There could be tension between keeping the Sabbath and honoring one's parents. There could be that. Right, there could be other tension, but that's the one that comes closest to my mind.
One commandment against another commandment.
Right.
We have the concept of Corbin, you remember. You could put everything for God, then your parents couldn't get it anymore. So there'd be tension. I'd just like to ask a question I asked you privately up here. I wonder if this had been IVF.
Interesting.
Rather than going through the dirty deed here. I wonder if we would feel differently.
So the concentration camp has this fertility clinic. She goes to the fertility clinic as impregnated by insemination rather than by intercourse. Would that make a big difference? Probably so. You know, we'll talk about this later. Dr. Provonsha didn't believe that there was a significant ethical difference between intercourse and insemination. And he thought they were equally unacceptable. But I can't let down, we're out of time. Most people think there's a difference between the two. Okay, let's have the benediction. Thank you all for being good sports.
Do you want to do it or
one second. Let's have Forrest do that. Next Sabbath afternoon, we will have the author of this book. This is the definitive biography just published last year by Oxford University Press about John Whitmer, or Wittner, however you want to say it, the man who saved so many Jews in Holland during World War II times. It's the same person about whom Flee the Captor was written, but this is an exhaustive, detailed biography of the man. So next Sabbath afternoon, 3 o'clock at the Damaso Amphitheater.
At this time, we'll do our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.